Our guest of honor tonight, Norman Lebrecht, is a British commentator on music, cultural affairs. He is a novelist, and he's the author of the classical music blog Slipped Disc. He was a columnist for The Telegraph from 1994 to 2002, an assistant editor of the London Evening Standard from 2002 to 2009. On the BBC Radio 3, he presented Lebrecht Live beginning in 2000, and the Lebrecht Interview from 2006 to 2016. He won the Whitebread Award in 2002 for his novel, The Song of Names, which was later turned into a fantastic film featuring A-listers like Clive Owen and Tim Roth, and which won a number of awards as well. I would highly recommend the film. Perhaps we will get to it a little later in the evening. And he also writes a column for the magazine Standpoint. One of the great accolades I have found online for our guest of honor tonight is from Gilbert Kaplan, who describes Norman as surely the most controversial and arguably most influential journalist covering classical music. We are here tonight to focus specifically, at least in the formal remarks, which will be followed by Q&A, on Norman's latest book, which is an incredible overview and insight into a topic close to many of our hearts, highlighting surely a trend and an influential arc of impact the Jewish people have had on our world throughout history, but specifically taking a 100-year or so period. The book is titled Anxiety and Genius: How Jews Changed the World. And one of the greatest accolades for this book I have found online is one by Tanjil Rashid, who wrote in the Times, claims to have, quote unquote, changed the world tend to be exaggerations. But Lebrecht's subtitle, How Jews Changed the World, 1847 to 1947, seems understated. The world wasn't changed, it was remade. What an incredible description of an incredible book. Without further ado, I give you the wonderful Norman Lebrecht.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mendel. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Let me just say that before, if we happen to say any words of Torah tonight in my talk and in our discussion afterwards, let them be for the soul of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who we lost this week, and whose enthusiasm for this subject still bubbles in my ears. We had several conversations about it over the last year. And the wonderful thing about Lord Sachs was he never pretended to know anything. If you'd raised something, he would say, I don't know anything about that. Can you explain it to me? And it's this humility, this curiosity, this thirst for knowledge that we carry with us in our great sorrow at his loss. So please let it be Leilui Nishmat Jonathan Sachs. The topic of the book, Genius and Anxiety, is a question that's preoccupied me for at least half of my adult life. And I'm amazed that nobody has addressed it before, because it is simply this. Between the middle of the 19th and the 20th centuries, there are about 36 individuals who changed the way we see the world. Society, science, the arts, they transformed them, they overturned them. Of these 36 individuals, half are Jews. How is that possible? This is like saying, Jews at the time were 0.02% of the world population. It's like saying that Liechtenstein is responsible for the whole of European civilization, from Rembrandt to Shakespeare to Beethoven. It's just not rational to think that a very, very tiny minority could have been involved and initiated revolutions as enormous as relativity, as some of the great advances in science, as essential changes to the way that the French and German languages sound. We may come to that tonight. If not, we'll do it another time. Just about every facet of our life was changed by something that a Jewish person did between the middle of the 19th and the middle of the 20th century. How on earth do we come to terms with that? How on earth do we begin to understand it? And there are, I've searched for answers. My favorite antiquarian bookshop in Tel Aviv has a front room and a back room. The front room is where the casual people go. The back room is where you get let in after you've been there as many times as I have. It's Pollock's on King George. And the back room is full of books with the same title, And the title in 17 different languages is The Jewish Question. Ashela Yehudit, La Question Juive, Die Jüdische Frage, and so forth. And they're not necessarily asking this question, but this is my Jewish question. How is it possible that so many Jews were responsible for the changes in the most fertile period of human life on earth? How is it possible that half of those changes are initiated by Jews? And I find in various books that I bought at that same bookshop down the years, a couple of possible approaches. One is that, well, the Jews were confined to ghettos for many centuries. They were let out of the ghettos, and this explosion of creativity is a response to the breaking down of the ghetto walls. Nice idea, just chronologically all wrong. I start the book at 1847, which is where I begin the period, where I believe the period of fertility begins. The ghetto walls were broken down 50 years earlier. So these are not children of the ghetto. These are great-grandchildren of the ghetto. They're 3 generations down, 2.5, 3 generations down. So it's not a response to Christian oppression and Christian confinement, not directly, although we will find that the anxiety element is a bit. And the other argument is the case for Jewish exceptionalism. The Jews are special, they're the chosen people, they've refined their culture, they are this, that, and the other. But it's just so easy to refute that, because if this were the case, then these Jewish geniuses would have come from across the Jewish people, but they don't. They're concentrated in a fairly small area of the globe called Central Europe. They don't come from the whole of the Jewish settlement around the Muslim crescent. They are not on the whole Sephardim, although 3 or 4 of them are. They don't come from Russia. They certainly don't come from America, which hadn't really got its intellectual gears grinding yet in the early part of that period. They're just from this particular area at this particular time. What on earth is going on to ferment this fertility? There is one other objection that I've had in early responses to the Hebrew edition of the book. People in Israel say, well, some of them aren't Jewish. Why are they not Jewish? Because they converted to Christianity. Why does that make them less Jewish? It makes them less Jewish in terms that you can't name a street in Tel Aviv after them. For that, they're not Jewish enough. But in terms of their actual Jewishness, every single one of them has retained this Jewish essence all the way through their lives. And if you want an example, let me give you the example of Felix Mendelssohn. I'm on home territory here, so it's easy. Felix Mendelssohn, as you know, great composer, probably not front rank, second rank great composer, okay? But really, really important composer. He's the man who defined the role of music director, the head of an orchestra, a phenomenally pivotal thinker in the evolution of Western music. He is a man to whom more members of the Church of England have got married than any other musician, than any other composer. His wedding march has probably assured the continuity of British society, because without him, they would never have procreated. And he's a man who, having been converted by his father as a child at 7, 8 years old, is the perfect Christian. He is the perfect Lutheran. He is immaculately dressed. He speaks the most faultless High German. He is a friend of kings and queens. When he comes to London, Queen Victoria, Prince Albert invite them not just to Buckingham Palace, but to the private apartments. And they proudly show him the cots where their children are sleeping. And they ask Mendelssohn to play a little something on the piano to send the children to sleep. And then Queen Victoria sits down next to him and they play forehand for a little bit. He is the intimate of the great people of the Christian world. You couldn't have somebody who was outwardly more Christian. And Mendelssohn, in fact, in his public writings, and indeed in his published letters, only once refers to himself as Jewish, and that only peripherally and vestigially. But I'll give you one example that I discovered while writing the book, and it's this. In 1833, when he is 23, 24 years old, he comes to London, not for the first time. And his hosts say to him, well, what would you like to do today? He said, I'd like to go to the House of Commons. And they said, oh, you know, it's such a lovely day. Why don't we go to the park? He said, no, I want to go to the House of Commons because they are debating something that's called the Jew Bill. The Jew Bill was the first attempt to grant civil rights to Jews in this country. They didn't have rights of citizenship. They certainly didn't have rights of voting. And this was the first bill that had been brought before the House of Commons in order to give some kind of equality and safety and social standing to Jews in England. And Mendelsohn wants to be there. He wants to be there for the Jew Bill. How do we know this? Because there is an unpublished letter that I discovered in the course of writing the book, unpublished letter that he writes home to his mother. And he says he's tremendously involved in the debate and he's tremendously proud of what's going on. And he says, Mendelssohn writes to his mother, early today, the Jews were emancipated. That makes me proud. The Times suggests it is better for us in England. This is Mendelsohn, the Lutheran. It is better for us in England. And then he goes on to say there were some Jew haters among the MPs. And he uses the Yiddish word, Rosha, wicked person, an evil person, a hater. And he then peppers the letter with further expressions in Yiddish and in Hebrew, showing that the language of the family, for all that the family has converted, has remained intensely Jewish. So when I refer to Jews in this context, I refer to people who see themselves as Jewish, regardless of what other faith they have adopted. What is it that can possibly connect Mendelssohn with Karl Marx, another one who proclaims himself to be not only barely Jewish, ex-Jewish, a long time ago Jewish, but actually somebody who hates Jews, who wrote one of the most ferocious anti-Semitic pamphlets of the 1840s, attacking the Jews as usurers and saying that the only way to liberate society from capitalism is to liberate it from the Jews. Marx comes to live in London. He has 2 daughters. He sends his daughters out to try and win members for communism, win supporters for socialism and communism. He sends one of them down to the East End and he says, when you go and you address a meeting in the East End, say you're Jewish. You're Jewish. The things that you are teaching them, the values of social equality, the values of equal rights, these are Jewish values. You say this to your East End audience who are Jewish, they will recognize you as Jewish. So these processes run through the minds even of those who have not just ceased to be Jewish, but are actively hostile to Jews. What connects them to Albert Einstein, who has, does Einstein believe in God? I mean, there are several books that ask that question. Einstein havers in his relationship to God, and he actually once writes to a schoolgirl saying, you know, in the end, if there is order in the universe, I have to accept that it is a higher order. But Einstein is Jewish in so many ways. We'll come to how Jewish he is in his thinking if we have the time. But in one particular way fascinates me. We know that Einstein, when he was between 11 and 12 years old, perhaps including just after the period after turning 12, became fascinated by Judaism. He came from a non-practicing, very assimilated family, but he must have met someone from Chabad, because he came home to his parents one day and said, we're going to make the house kosher and we're going to keep Shabbat and everything's going to be like by the book. And the parents said, Albert, please. And he said, no, this is how it's going to be. For 6 months, the Einstein family keep the mitzvot because little Albert, who's going to be bar mitzvah the following year, says, this is what you've got to do. And then Albert loses interest and the family falls away in a certain way, but Albert Einstein never loses his pride in being Jewish, never loses his recognition of being Jewish, and never loses, above all, his sense of wonderness at the book of Psalms. Because if there is order in the universe, Einstein sees that as being foretold in the Book of Psalms. And at the slightest excuse, he will quote you from the Psalms. And if you happen to see Albert Einstein walking down the street and seemingly immersed in thought, and you think, well, this is going to be the third theory of relativity, but you got close to him and you saw his lips were moving, they were probably moving in recitation of a psalm, which he carried with him all the time. So his Jewish identity is expressed through these ancient texts and through his awareness of a greater scheme to the universe. What seems to connect these people, and many more, what seems to connect them is something that I define in para-Freudian terms as a collective cultural unconscious. Freud thought he invented the unconscious. He didn't. The unconscious actually exists in Talmudic sources, but we'll come to Freud and the Talmud in a little bit. There is a collective unconscious among many Jewish people, which prompts them to think in a slightly different way, to approach a problem from a slightly different angle, tangentially, sometimes confrontationally, and sometimes just by thinking, we would say, outside the box. But it's not outside the box. The box doesn't exist. They're just thinking laterally and possibly vertically, but they're thinking in a way that the majority of society hasn't even begun to think. They haven't contemplated this possibility. And the one example that jumped out at me is about a man that nobody knows. If I were to ask you, I don't think, do you have responses here on chat? Yeah. If I were to ask you when blood transfusions became safe, what sort of date would you give me? When I've done this before live audiences in the old days before COVID, when I've done it in front of live audiences, I've had answers that ranged from anything from about 1830 to 1930. Do we have any guesses as to when blood transfusions became safe and secure? When blood groups were discovered? We've got a 1920 here. We've got a 1900. Have we any advance on 1900? Leon Nahon says 1900. Who else have we got? 1790s? Rabbi Mendel to all panelists, I'm still Googling. All right, we've got an 1800. I'll tell you when it is. I'll put you out of your misery. I'll tell you when it is. It was 1900. Can you tell me who it was who made them safe? Nobody knows. Nobody remembers him. There is not even a book about him. There is one tiny monograph in German, which I have. But there's very little literature on him. His name was Karl Landsteiner. He was the son of a journalist in Vienna. He was born Jewish. When he was 18, his mother converted him to Catholicism. She said, you're going to university to study medicine. It'll be good for the career. So he became a Catholic. Landsteiner became a medical researcher and joined a team that was searching for a cure for various childhood diseases. But he was not satisfied with this. He became perturbed by the very, very high level of mortality among people who'd undergone abdominal surgery. At this time, Vienna was the world capital of abdominal surgery. If you want to become a surgeon, you went to Vienna as you're finishing school. Hundreds, thousands of Americans went there. English surgeons went there, French surgeons went there. It was absolutely the place. And they pretty much perfected the art of it. The great surgeon, whose name was Theodor Billroth, and he said you had to kill 100 patients before you got to put your name on a procedure. Some said it was 1,000 patients. But Vienna was the center of abdominal surgery, and they got it down pretty much to perfection. Organically, what they did to you was absolutely fine. And once you came into the recovery room, 50% of the patients died. They didn't die from trauma from the surgery. They didn't die from post-operative infection, which was very rare in those days, possibly because the wards were much larger and they kept a greater distance between the patients. They died from something else. And Landsteiner is the first one who says, maybe it's the blood. Maybe it's the blood we gave him as a transfusion. And his colleagues said, don't be silly, get back to your desk, do what you're doing. And Landsteiner said, no. So he went around his lab and he took a blood sample from everybody, all of his colleagues in the lab. And then he took it to the most powerful microscope in the University of Vienna. And lo and behold, by the end of the day, he'd found 3 distinct and separate blood types. He called them A, B, and C. His colleagues said, no, it's too obvious, make it A, B, and O. So it was A, B, and O, all right. And then he wrote a paper and he presented it in 1900 in front of the annual Congress of German physicians and scientists. And he was practically railroaded out of town. They howled him down. They shouted at him. The president of the association was the great Paul Ehrlich, himself a Jew from Breslau, the man who discovered chemotherapy, the first treatment for cancer. Ehrlich and the others said to Landsteiner, go back to your bench, you're out of your depth, you're out of your field. Blood is blood is blood. If it's red, it's blood. If it's not red, it's something else. Okay, that's all we need to know. And Landsteiner, dejected, went back to Vienna and thought, okay, failed. 6 years later, a young surgeon at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York was about to perform his first major surgery. Well, do you know why it was called Mount Sinai? Because Columbia Hospital didn't accept Jews. This is 1906. So Mount Sinai was the Jewish hospital. The young surgeon who's about to perform his first major surgery, he doesn't want to lose his patient. It looks bad on the record if you have a 0-1 scoreline. So he said to his colleagues, maybe we should try the Landsteiner procedure. I've heard about it, but why don't we all take samples of blood and then we'll see if we can just put aside some blood stocks that match the one that the patient has. So they did that. And he performed the operation. And the operation was successful. And what do you know? The patient lived because he'd received the right blood. And ever since then, in 1906, we can go under the knife, relatively confident that whatever else we might die of, it will not be plasma shock. It will not be receiving the wrong blood, thanks to Karl Landsteiner. What was it that enabled Karl Landsteiner to think, to discover that blood is not equal, that there is more than one type of blood? We don't know very much about his thinking, but we do know that there's something in his background, because he said it in a couple of letters. There's something that he says he'd had from somewhere, that blood is not uniform. Where would that have come from? If you look in the Mishnah, if you look in the Gemara, you'll find many references to differences in blood. Differences in blood between animals and humans, that for sure. Differences in blood between different animals that are brought to sacrifice. Differences in blood between when the blood is considered ritually pure, ritually impure. There is a passage in the Talmud of Zavachim, which refers to 2 different types of blood in the body, the blood of the head and the blood of the abdomen. And there are various other differentiations. There's a lot of discussion of blood in various sections of the Talmud. And the assumption throughout is that blood is not uniform. There are different types of blood. Now, would Landsteiner have known this? No. Had he ever studied Talmud? No. Had his father studied Talmud? No. Had his grandfather? Quite possibly, if not probably. Somewhere within his unconscious, somewhere within his background, there lurks an awareness that blood can be diverse. If blood is diverse, then it is permissible, not just permissible, it's actually mandatory to ask the question that could it be that patients are dying because they had the wrong blood? Quod erat demonstrandum. He's simply asking a question from a different angle, from a different aspect, and solving a major problem of mortality, enabling us to continue to live to a reasonable age. Let me give you a more direct way of how Jews ask a different question, or ask a question in a different fashion. Ever since the Garden of Eden, men and women have been trying to have sex without having too many babies. And it was a problem. And down the centuries, they tried various means of contraception, and none of them was fail-safe, none of them was foolproof. They tried counting, they tried barrier methods, nothing worked. In the 1930s, this became more, there was more pressure to find a solution, and 4 scientists applied their minds to it. One of them went off to Mexico and came back with a giant yam. He was the non-Jewish scientist among the 4. He came back with this enormous plant, and out of that plant, he found something that could be synthesized into the basis of what they were looking for. The other 3, who didn't know each other, who had no contact with each other, the other 3 approached the problem by reframing the question. Instead of saying, how can we have sex without having babies? They said, in what condition can a woman be in order for her to have intercourse and not to become pregnant? In what condition must the woman be in order for her to have sex safely? Simply turned it on its head. And almost from the point of asking the question, they had the answer. Obvious, isn't it? She has to be pregnant already. If she's pregnant, then she can't fall pregnant twice. And from having that answer, it's just 2 short steps to the invention of the contraceptive pill. If you can simulate pregnancy in a female body, if you can fool the body that it's pregnant, then the body is not going to conceive. This is almost a classic Talmudic way of flipping a question in order to produce a completely novel, earth-shattering answer. What pleases me immensely is that one of the 3 Jewish scientists, the one who actually made the biggest drive towards producing the contraceptive pill in the 1950s, when he founded the company that was going to produce the pill, he went to the town rabbi and said, I'd like to have you on my board. He said, these are issues that are beyond the remit of science. I want to have a moral dimension on my board that tells us if we're doing the right thing, that can guide us through it. It was the right way to proceed. It was an honorable way to proceed. It was also a particularly Jewish way of proceeding. When in doubt, ask a rabbi. So these are just ways in which questions were reframed. If we go to Sigmund Freud, we all know what Freud has contributed to humanity. We all know the very great ideas that he brought us, and we all know, some of us know, the very great errors that he made in the course of them. The first was the emphasis on infant sexuality as one of the prime motivators of human conduct. And the second, far more important, was the prescription, the invention of psychoanalysis, which is the talking cure. Talk it through, take it out, talk it through. These are Freud's 2 great submissions to civilization. When you look at the practice of psychoanalysis, when you look at the principles and the ways in which Freud wrote about how his thinking was developing and how to treat a person in psychoanalysis, what you're finding is that he lays down a number of principles. What shocked me was to find how familiar some of these principles are from very, very ancient Jewish sources. Now, before I go any further, before I identify the source, let me just tell you, Freud was a very proud Jew. Freud never for one moment denied his Jewishness. There was a wonderful speech that he gave to Bnei B'rith on his 70th birthday, in which he says, all my brothers are Jews. I've always felt proud to be a member of this group. I'm Jewish through and through. I just know nothing about Judaism. I don't have anything to do with Judaism. I don't believe in God. When I was growing up, we never did anything about Judaism in the house. I'm a Jew, but I'm a Jew who has nothing to do with Judaism, right? And I know nothing. I know nothing. Well, as so often with Freud, this is a fiction. It's a way of trying to mislead us about how he is proceeding with his ideas. We look into some of Freud's early correspondence and we find that he's mentioning all sorts of Jewish practices that he's clearly seen as a child. Yes, he says he never went to a synagogue, but we do know that he received a gift on his 30th birthday, which was a typical gift that was given to Austro-German Jewish children. It was a set of books that was given to them on their bar mitzvah. That was pretty much keen. And for me, one of the key elements in exploding Freud's thesis that he knew nothing about Judaism, he actually wrote a couple of times to people. Somebody wanted to send him something in Yiddish. He said, I can't read Hebrew. I can't read Hebrew letters. I never learned how to read Hebrew letters. Well, there is a Bible, a Hebrew Bible, given to Freud on his 30th birthday, grown man, by his father. And in it, I've seen it. And on the frontispiece, Freud's father addresses him, Livni hayakar Shlomo, to my beloved son Shlomo, not Sigmund, Shlomo. I'm giving you this present, carries on in Hebrew, I'm giving you this present on your maturity, on your 30th birthday. Clearly, Freud's father knew that Freud could read Hebrew, and Freud's denial of its ability to read Hebrew was simply a way of recreating his character. So Freud clearly knew something about Judaism and knew something about Jewish sources, but also had a much broader Jewish unconscious that enabled him to form psychoanalysis in the way that he did. And when I started looking through the principles of analysis, I've been reading Freud all my life. I mean, he is wonderful. He is a wonderful writer. If he'd been a novelist, he would have been the greatest. In fact, some of his stuff probably is a bit of fiction. But he's also a very lucid writer. When he writes his principles of analysis, he takes you into his way of thinking. And I start reading the principles and they look familiar. Where are they familiar from? They're familiar from the 13 rules of exegesis that Ashkenazi Jews read every morning in their morning prayer. It's called the Breita of Rabbi Yishmael. The Breita is something that got left out of the Mishnah and the Gemara, but it can still be important. And Rabbi Yishmael says there are 13 ways in which we are able to explain and understand our scriptures. The way we find, if we have a passage in Torah that we don't understand, apply one of these 13 methods, ... 1 to 13. And I'm looking at ... 1 to 13, and 7 of them are Freud's principles of psychoanalysis. Freud, the inventor of the unconscious, has assimilated into his unconscious these something of the principles of Rabbi Yishmael, who exists in our morning prayers up to this day. So there is this collective awareness of a Jewish intellectual heritage, a Jewish way of thinking, a Jewish way of phrasing a question, a Jewish way of behaving and of comporting oneself in society that seems to inspire many, if not most of the individuals that I'm describing. Where does the anxiety come in? All the way through. There is this perpetual awareness of the fragility of Jewish existence. That at any point, the rights that have been won, whether they are civil rights or whether they're simply rights of residence, the newfound ability of Jews to assert themselves in society, the newfound ability of Jews to make scientific inventions, to spread their ideas around the world, of Jews like Heine to completely transform the German language within it, to write a poem on the Princess Shabbat, on the how the Orthodox Shabbat is constructed from Friday afternoon until the 3 stars come out on Saturday night, to write an ode of joy to the Sabbath, which includes 2 stanzas on the traditional Ashkenazi Sabbath afternoon dish of the cholent. That Heine, who is able to go out and express his pride in being Jewish in the 1840s, is riddled with anxiety. That it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time till they shut me up, or they expel me, or they kill me. the legacy of persecution is there with everyone. It's there in Freud. Freud we see very often. Where Freud makes an error, it's because he's rushed to a conclusion. He's rushing to a conclusion because he fears what may come next. And when it comes next, what Freud does is simply astonishing. You all know what happened in March 1938 with the Anschluss, when the Nazis marched into Vienna. Every Wednesday night, all the psychoanalysts in Vienna would gather at Freud's apartment at Berggasse 19, and they would all share their experiences, they would share their patients' problems, they would help each other to try and relieve the burden of human misery among their patients, and so that each could go back to their practice and help people. That's what the Psychoanalytic Association was there for. This is the next Wednesday after the Anschluss, and everything has been vandalized. Vienna, Jews are taken out and killed into the streets. They make to scrub the pavements. They are dragged off to concentration camps. They are humiliated in every way. There is no safety. There is no security. They don't know which way they're going to turn. Freud himself is raided by the SS. His flat is turned upside down, inside out, and they take all the valuables from his apartment. He, of course, makes a Jewish joke to the SS as they're leaving. He said, you know, people say that I charge a very high fee, but I've never had such an expensive visit as yours. Maybe he made an SS man laugh, who knows. Wednesday night, when the psychoanalysts come scuttling through the streets, frightened of their own shadows, hoping that they can get to Berggasse 19 in safety, and they come up to Freud's apartment and they are visibly shaking, they're trembling, they've been traumatized. And Freud sits them down and he tells them a story. And he tells his story word for word as it appears in the Gemara. And it's the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai during the destruction of Jerusalem. Remember, this is Freud who says he knows nothing at all of Judaism. And he is quoting the Talmud, literally verbatim. He gets one word wrong. During the destruction of Jerusalem, and the city is under siege, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was the great scholar, says to his students, you must smuggle me out of the city to the Roman general who is putting us under siege. I need to see the Roman general. So they put him in a coffin and they smuggled him out. They said, here, we're taking a coffin for burial. And they get him to Vespasian, who is the general who is leading the siege. And they open the coffin, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai gets out, and he says to Vespasian, hail, emperor. And Vespasian says to him, you're a bit premature here. I'm just the commander-in-chief of the forces. The emperor is in Rome. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, hail, emperor. At that moment, the door of the tent bursts open, messengers arrive from Rome, the emperor has died, Vespasian is the new Caesar. Caesar says to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, thank you for the promotion. What is it that you want from me? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, I want to go with a few of my disciples. I want you to give us safe conduct to a place called Yavne. And we're just going to go there, and we're going to sit there, and we're going to study. And I know that you're going to destroy Jerusalem. You're going to destroy the temple. We want to take our faith there. We want to renew our faith. We want to make our faith presentable to an era when we no longer have Jerusalem. And so it was. And they went to Yavne. And the Judaism that we have today is the Judaism that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai saved for us in that meeting with Vespasian. And Freud says to his fellow analysts, he says, that was then, and this is us. And we will go out from this place, and we will take our psychoanalysis with us. And we will reestablish ourselves in Paris and in London and in New York and in Los Angeles. And we will take with us the faith of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that we will succeed, that we will not die as in an act of brutality. That this should have sunk so deep into Freud's unconscious that it gave him and his science the means to continue is nothing less than flabbergasting. This is Jewish continuity, to use a phrase of the late Lord Sachs. This is Jewish continuity in its essence. This is Jewish genius operating in the time of greatest anxiety to enable whatever it is that Jews bring to the world, whatever culture, whatever civilization, whatever manner of thinking, whatever creativity, we haven't touched on the arts, whatever creativity it is that the Jews have given to us. This is it. This is its essence. The essence is to draw upon the deep wells of Jewish knowledge, of Jewish experience, and of the Jewish unconscious in order to ensure the survival of those ideas and those values that Jews have brought to the world. That, for me, is genius and anxiety. Thank you so much.
Wow, that's a fascinating overview. And I think it's clear to our audience that you have a masterful way of teaching through storytelling. Because in the end, that really is how the best messages come through in the Torah, which teaches us through story. You know, I think even there's one of the early references to the Torah is actually Mashal HaKadmoni, the original metaphor or analogy. And I find it fascinating because, you know, you could read one of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not covet, or you could read the story of Joseph and his brothers, where the story comes to life and light in a way that draws you in emotionally, experientially, etc., in a way where you're able to absorb the message much more profoundly. And I think that's the incredible power of your book. It's not an academic work that's inaccessible in some ivory tower, you know, talking specifically or strictly to historians, but it's there for the masses, and that's one of the great gifts of this book. So thank you so much